Here's a reminder that 14 the Cybermen Part 2 is now available to watch as I take a look at the evolution of the Cybermen from 2006 to 2014. The video is linked in the description below and is going to be in a card. Hello, my name is Dan Johnson and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about who the next showrunner of Doctor Who should be. This came after yesterday's news that Chibnall and Jodie Whitaker are going to be leaving together at the end of 2022, so apparently that's autumn 2022, but I imagine that that'll be the last appearance of the year. So there is quite a bit of Jodie left, but still not a lot. I wonder whether this whole thing has been done as a reactionary of just general approval for the series, I suppose, and whether, because obviously The Time of Children didn't go that well, and Revolution of the Daleks wasn't exactly the thing that everyone hoped it would be, even though I did quite enjoy it. I think that there's been a lot of rockiness over the last few seasons, and a lot of it you could put down to him being like new to it, but then now he's had quite a big chance in quite a few years. And also, it's a difficult thing to take on. There's also a lot of pressure, and as you can imagine, an awful lot of online trolling, bullying that comes from being the showrunner of Doctor Who and from playing the Doctor that some people just don't like. And obviously, that news dropped last night, and because of how I work, annoyingly, I haven't worked since Sunday, and then the first day that I'm back at work, the news drops about 15 minutes before I go into work. So I was just too late to cover it in terms of news, and this is my new way of doing it. So obviously I don't like talking about news most of the time because I feel like it's just reactionary. It's just me sitting here saying exactly what I've seen on an article. But then I thought I would sort of add on that and sort of say who I would like to be the next showrunner. Some of them are more hopeful than others. The first one that I have is one that I think will probably be quite likely, but obviously there's some negatives to this as well, and that's Pete McCoy. Now, he is the writer of Kablam, and a lot of people have regarded that episode as being one of the better episodes of Jodie Whittaker's era. And overall, I just think he's quite a solid writer, and he's written a lot for the collection box sets and done a lot towards them. I know he's quite heavily involved in their production, but he's also a writer and director of those trailers that appear. And I think that logically, to kind of promote him up to series writer would be a good idea. Because there's a lot of cool stuff that he could do, because he could kind of merge classic Who and new Who together. Because if you look at the sales for that second Doctor TARDIS set that came out a couple of weeks ago, that set sold out, and it had like 4,000 copies. There was enough stock, and yet it still sold out. So it's not like people are bored of the classic era. In fact, I think that the classic era should maybe be more focal into Doctor Who going forward. And I think Pete McCoy could do that very well. I'm not quite sure if I'm pronouncing his surname correctly, though. My next choice is probably a little bit too hopeful, and that is Toby Whitehouse. Now, he was the writer of multiple episodes of Doctor Who from all the way from 2006 to about 2017. He's written stories such as The Lie of the Land, School Reunion, Vampires in Venice, Where Is My Phone? He's written The God Complex, A Town Called Mercy, Under the Lake, and Before the Flood. And he's also written for Torchwood with Greeks Bearing Gifts, which was a Series 1 episode. He's also written his own show. I mean, it was quite a few years ago, but a few years ago he wrote his own show called Being Human, and then there was like an American remake which he also had some involvement in. But he wasn't just writer; he was also producer. So he was writing and producing a sort of sci-fi sort of fantasy show about sort of vampires and werewolves, and I think one of them is a ghost as well, living within our society and sort of trying to blend in, I suppose. Pretty solid thing. Quite dark, though, compared to Doctor Who. But as you've seen, he has written for Doctor Who before. As a bit of a revamp, I think it's important to do one of two things. Go back to what people liked before. So go back to writers like Toby Whitehouse and that kind of gang, and go back to them and use them to write more stories. Or bring in some completely new blood that is untried, untested, but has a vision like John Nathan Turner does, or did, with the 80s Who, where, he's not really making the show as what it used to be, but he's making something that he has an actual vision for. Because there's multiple moments during, like Behind the Sofas, when Bonnie Langford has like turned to Sylvester McCoy and Sophie Aldred and said that this is such a John Nathan Turner thing to be in an episode. I think they're referring to those two old women in Paradise Towers. I don't know what Toby Whitehouse is doing right now, but I saw a lot of sort of stage writing, sort of that kind of production credit. So maybe he's not currently looking at working for Doctor Who, especially on something that is so important. If you took, the head showrunner position, but as a writer, perhaps he could probably give up some good stories. This isn't really one for me because I feel like he's just too popular, too busy to do it. But Neil Gaiman is probably going to be someone that is going to get mentioned in the comments, and gets mentioned quite a lot to me, is Neil Gaiman, just because he's a quite prolific writer of sort of sci-fi fantasy. And, even though he's written his own books and, Good Omens, starring David Tennant and Michael Sheen, there's sort of that sort of connection to Doctor Who, and he's written Doctor Who in the past, but he's written that awful episode that I always mention that is awful, called Nightmare in Silver. I despise it, and he's written that, and he wrote The Doctor's Wife as well, which is quite a good episode. He does understand Doctor Who, which makes him a good choice. Then again, he is very busy. My next suggestion is Maxine Alderton, who wrote The Haunting of Villa Diodati in Series 12. I feel like she kind of got Doctor Who within that story, and I feel like as new blood, she might be a good person to have, because as I mentioned earlier, someone with that's new blood and with vision would actually be able to write a really good series and sort of revitalise it after Series 11 and Series 12. And once that's done, you could kind of bring it back up to what it was like, in Stephen Moffat's era, eventually, over time. And I think that would be exactly where the show wants to go right now. I think it's not a case of continuing, but it's more a case of going back and just bringing back fans that were lost during the 13th Doctor's era. I just felt like her story idea was what Doctor Who needs to be. I mean, because we've had a lot of crappy story ideas in Series 11 and Series 12, but I felt like the idea that Mary Shelley saw Cyberman during that night is pretty good. And that whole kind of connection between, Frankenstein's monster and the Cyberman is a really good idea. I don't know whether Ashad was completely Chibnall's idea and she just used Ashad in her story, and whether the whole Mary Shelley thing was also her Chibnall's idea and she used it. We'll probably never know, but I just feel like she had a good grip on understanding Doctor Who, which some writers just simply don't have. My next point is not really a person, but more of an idea. Just like the Avengers, the writers should be joined together in order to create a writers' team of showrunners instead of being just one person. Because, as I've mentioned a few times briefly, it's difficult for just one man to be the writer of the whole series, or the overseer of the whole series anyway. Why does it have to be that way? Because it's an awful lot of pressure to be able to do that, because, I mean, no showrunner has had a completely flawless run. I mean, look at Stephen Moffat. His run was all over the place for most of the time. And then you have gems like Series 5 and Series 10. But, look at Series 7, some of Series 6. All of that's completely mental. But nobody was standing there telling him that it was completely mental because he's sole showrunner. And, a second opinion is very valuable as a writer. And I think that multiple opinions, multiple brains, all talking and all knowledgeable on sci-fi and that sort of understanding of how Doctor Who works, even just the basic premise, would be able to write a pretty solid story. Like Big Finish, it's not just one person, it tends to be two people, and then sort of producers get in on how the story's made, but there's never just one of them. There's always seems to be two of them that come together to write it. So because of that, I think that that's where Doctor Who needs to go. Like, it needs to have more than one person as showrunner, because showrunners tend to, have a lot of pressure on them, and that's not really what you want to have when they're trying to construct a show that you love dearly. And never mind just that, the idea that we're giving people like Not My Doctors someone to blame entirely. I mean, they blame Jodie Whitaker, which isn't even her fault. She just says the lines at the end of the day. But Chibnall's really to blame, and he gets sort of the flack of it as well. And I just don't think that nowadays it's really fair for just one person to take on such a high-ranking role. So, who do you think should be the next showrunner? These are only a few. There's a whole bunch more. The writer of Fugitive of the Dune, whose name has slipped my mind, Vinny Patel, I think his name is. He'd be a good showrunner. I could do one of these for like the next Doctor and who that could be, now that we definitely know that she's leaving, but I feel like that's already been done to death. And to be honest, I don't really have huge expectations about who the next Doctor will be. So I find it quite a difficult question to ask, especially when a lot of the time I find that people's choices of Doctor infuriate me. Personally, I like to see a little bit more new blood, but I'm not quite sure the new blood is actually going to work. Some up-and-coming writers would be a good idea. Those that actually have written sci-fi, may I add, because, I mean, Chibnall went for people that have written, like, Casualty. And if you're writing sci-fi for the first time, you might not necessarily get it for someone that has loved it all their life. I think you need Doctor Who fans, really, to write Doctor Who. You need Doctor Who fans and those that are prolific sci-fi writers. And they don't even need to be prolific, they just need to understand the concept of Doctor Who, in fact, to be able to write the show. And I don't think that Chibnall had those guest writers. A new team of people that knew what they were doing. I mean, look at The Office, right? The Office, I know it's no longer a show anymore, but the writers team for that show was huge. There was like a group of people, like a class of people who wrote that show. So I think that it's, gone of the days where it's just one person, even though Marvel shows do seem to follow that trend. Thank you very much for watching. Hopefully you did enjoy this video. If you did, make sure to like, subscribe, and I shall see you soon.